Welcome off the post. I'm Russ Cohen. We've got Anthony Mingione. And how are you?
Adapting to the hour loss, Russ. I'm getting there. Plenty of caffeine.
Yeah. We're all adapting to that. And Michael Jello, I'm sure you're happy with the situation.
Well, if it's about spring ahead, no. I've loaded up with a couple cups of black tea, so I'm ready to go. But I got lots to talk about. Believe me.
Yeah, well, spring will come in June in Buffalo. That's okay. And we have Scott Burnside from Burnside on the Hockey Newsletter, and also a legendary writer. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me aboard. I actually, had no problem getting up. Maybe it's the post-trade deadline, adrenaline, and have no problem getting up and getting ready for the show.
Scott, okay. I needed we did a 2-hour show for the deadline, and I was like, at 5 o'clock, I needed to take a nap. I must be getting old. I was all stressed out, and at no reason. I don't know.
Well, again, I think, you guys have all been in it for a long time, and you know how important the trade deadline is and the buzz and the buildup. And I get why it's so important for fans. And of course, we know it's like a national holiday for a lot of hockey broadcast networks. And
some people took off. Some people messaged me they took off from work.
Of course. Yeah, no, I'm not surprised by that at all. And really, I was, especially with so many big moves, coming early, the initial Rantanen deal and Michael Granlund and Cody Ceci going to Dallas and JT Miller going to the Rangers. I wondered if it would be much quieter because there were so many teams that were, it was hard to separate the buyers from the sellers. There were a lot of sellers out there, as it turned out. And a lot of stuff happened that I think was surprising to people. And of course, it starts with the Rantanen thing, but there were a lot of good players who made moves, and there were teams that really, and I think, I don't know whether it's, the keeping up with the Joneses or the arms race, comparison, that type of thing. But, when you watch what Florida and Tampa and I think to a lesser degree Toronto did, and you look at Colorado and Dallas, and again, a little bit to a lesser degree with what Winnipeg did, but and Edmonton, I think as well in that group, I think there's a lot of pressure to respond. And as we all know, one team wins the Stanley Cup, and lots of the deals, lots of teams that, do, make wholesale changes at the trade deadline to bulk up. Sometimes it doesn't work, right? No guarantee that any of this happens. And I think when you look back, sometimes the teams that are more tinkering, filling in around the edges. And I think, even though Vladimir Tarasenko is a wonderful player, I think to Florida a year ago, Kyle Okposo, Vladimir Tarasenko, who ended up really being sort of a mentor, third line guy, that was different than adding a top 6 forward or a top 4 defender. So a lot of excitement. At the end of the day, there's only going to be one winner. And at the end of the day, there'll be a lot of people going, geez, was it worth it to do all we did?
Right. So I'm going to focus on the negative here since I live in New Jersey and ask you, Scott, what the hell were the New Jersey Devils doing on trade deadline day? Like, they really failed.
Well, yeah. And I know I saw Tom Fitzgerald talking about the kinds of things that he was hoping to do. And, the prices were off the charts, right? I mean, there were good, solid players, but only good, solid players who were commanding second-round picks and packages. I think Jake Wallman's a fine ad for the Edmonton Oilers. That's a first-round pick that goes, right? I know it's conditional. It's a first-round pick that goes for Jake Wallman. A year ago, Detroit's gifting him. They threw in a second-round pick to get San Jose to take Jake Wallman off their hands. And less than a year later, Mike Greer, pulls in a first-round pick for Jake Wallman. So, I totally get the, and I think you also have to be realistic. And with all due respect to New Jersey, with the injuries that they've had and without Jack Hughes, what is the ceiling for that team? And I know the old cliche, Florida showed it 2 years ago, right? They don't even deserve to be in the playoffs 2 years ago.
I'm going to follow that up.
Yeah, Pittsburgh takes care of business. They don't even get in the playoffs. Florida goes to a Stanley Cup final against Vegas. So I get that part of it. But when you look at New Jersey and you look at how they're built, without Jack Hughes, what is you're not replacing him, right? Unless you're bringing in a Mikko Rantanen or somehow getting a JT Miller, all those kinds of things. That wasn't happening. I totally get if you're Tom Fitzgerald, you see what happens. Who knows, right? They're a playoff team. They're likely going to play Carolina in the first round unless the Rangers somehow sneak up and knock them out of that third spot. Carolina's its own story. I'd still like Carolina in that series against New Jersey right now, but who knows, right? So, I understand the Devils fans.
Well, I'm gonna follow it up.
Yeah.
Because for my website, Sportsology, Matthew Blittner covers them, and he got a quote from Tom Fitzgerald that said, Cody Glass gave them optionality. And to me, that was like, you got Dumoulin first, which really defense wasn't your biggest problem. And then you filled Jack Hughes with Cody Glass, and optionality is the reason. Like, the optics of this are just bad, Scott.
Yeah, but you're yes. I totally get that. But I guess, the reality is that you can't, it doesn't matter what you do, I don't think. Even if somehow you're bring in Mikko Rantanen, who I know he's a winger, not a center.
Right.
What move actually puts the Devils in a spot where you can say, I can see them winning a couple of rounds. And as opposed to, again, maybe they win a round or two based on how they're constructed right now. I probably don't see it that way, but I do get it. When you take out Jack Hughes, it just changes the landscape. So I'm sure Tom Fitzgerald's not saying, Jack Hughes, Cody Glass. No,
but he chased the big fish. He said he was chasing the big fish, and that took up a lot of his time. And it's like, well, maybe you should have focused on what you could get instead of trying to get Rantanen like 100 other teams.
Well, Russ, also, and I don't know this for sure, but there was a lot of talk about them going after Brock Nelson, and not that Brock Nelson would replace Jack Hughes, but he would slip into the second place.
I thought that would have been an option too.
I'd also on a second level, Scott Lawton's name was also mentioned with New Jersey as well.
But I think it's also fair to look at, when you look at the return for Scott Lawton and you look at the return for Brock Nelson, and listen, I cover Four Nations. I was a bit surprised Brock Nelson was on that roster to begin with. I thought he played very well. He is the kind of player you want come playoff time. But he's also not replacing Jack Hughes in your lineup. And you look, and Colorado paid a very heavy price for Brock Nelson, right? I'm not sure exactly what the plan
Devils
is.
Have a load of prospects. That's my whole thing. It's like, this season they had big expectations, and now it's lessened. That's all.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fair.
Scott, it's funny because it seems that the statement of longtime Leaf and Calgary Flames general manager Cliff Fletcher of draft schmaft has spread like wildfire throughout this league, because you've seen Florida, Tampa, Dallas, Toronto trade picks going through to 2027. And I understand the motivation here is sort of strike while the iron's hot. Dallas is a Stanley Cup contender. Florida won the Stanley Cup. We know that the core in Tampa can win because they've done it before. Toronto, they're always a top team in the regular season, but can't really, follow through in the postseason. But really, isn't Pittsburgh a cautionary tale of what's going to happen with these teams for 3 or 4 years down the line? Because you see what Pittsburgh is now, and they've exhausted all the draft picks. You've got Crosby, Malkin, Letang in their late 30s, and they're not going to get rid of them. And that team is going in a death spiral. So I wonder whether these general managers are just thinking in the short term and not thinking in the long term.
Yeah, it is a great question, and Pittsburgh is, it's kind of sad, frankly, to see how that team has devolved. I think they have more draft picks in the first 3 rounds over the next 3 years than any other team in the NHL, but it still doesn't address the fact that you have the core of that team is, the ownership. To me, it goes back to ownership. And what's your plan? If your plan is to keep, and listen, Sidney Crosby's still an elite player. He's still going to be the captain of Team Canada's Olympic team, in 2026. The man he's unbelievable. But probably an egregious mistake to keep Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang, and then compounded by bringing in Erik Karlsson. So where does that team go? Well, they're about to miss the playoffs for a 3rd straight year. Hard to imagine anything changes next year. But I will say this: it's interesting. Every team is its own thing, right? Like, would we not have said the same thing about the Washington Capitals a year ago after they snuck into the playoffs and were embarrassed by the Rangers? And yet here they are, the top team in the Eastern Conference. I don't know whether they can win a round or 2 or 3 in the playoffs, but boy, Spencer Carberry and the hockey ops team in Washington have done an astounding job of avoiding what's happened in Pittsburgh, right? So,
but I can tell you what the difference is. The difference is, like Mike said, Pittsburgh traded away a lot of prospects. Washington is one of the best drafting and developing teams in the league, so they always have prospects to put in their lineup and to trade.
Yeah, and look what they did during the summer. That they brought in Logan Thompson, Jacob Chikrin, Andrew Mangiapane, Pierre-Luc Dubois. They added five or six players to a team that just barely got in the playoffs, and now they've created that group around Ovechkin, and Ovechkin's playing unbelievably. Nobody expected him to play as well as he has.
Yeah, well, and I think you've hit the nail on the head here. It's about drafting and developing and having a hockey ops department like Florida. I just love what Bill Zito does, and he is the ultimate draft schmaft guy now.
Right.
I think they had 3 homegrown players on their roster in Game 7 last year against Edmonton, and it's a team that could very well go to a 3rd straight Stanley Cup final without much homegrown talent. But he and his hockey ops group have identified talent from outside, and whether it's in terms of free agency or whether it's in terms of trades, who can come in, fill a spot. Now, maybe it's fill a spot for a few weeks or a few months. I assume Brad Marchand will go back to Boston or wherever he goes, but who knows? Maybe he sticks around in Florida if they have another deep run. So, but when we think drafting and developing, I think we always think, oh, well, what have you done with your draft picks? But it's also about identifying other teams' players, picks, prospects. How do they fit for you, and can you parlay those kinds of additions into a championship caliber squad? And Florida shows that you can, but you have to have really good, smart people, and you have to bring in the right people, right? So it's not for everyone. And I think at some point, if you're a team like San Jose, I'm curious to see, okay, how quickly can Mike Grier get what is a pretty phenomenal core, I think, in San Jose now? How do you get back to relevancy there? Does it take a couple of years, or how close is that? But Florida's completely the opposite now. Tampa is the same way, as you mentioned. Julian Brisebois, God bless him, right? Just, okay, I've got these assets, I'm turning them.
I was talking about this with Anthony yesterday. Julian Brisebois could say that today, but he could say that because he drafted guys like Victor Hedman and some other key guys that you don't get any other way. And they've been and Ryan McDonough, hey, he wanted to leave New York because his wife didn't like New York. So it wasn't like, that was something where it was like an amazing thing. He just wanted to leave. So they got lucky with that. But that, there's some reasons for that too. And he can act like that today. Yeah. But in 3 years, he won't be acting like
that. That core group that he has. Point was a 3rd rounder. Sorelli was a 3rd rounder. They got Vasilevsky in the 1st round. So you can say draft schmaft, but you built that team through the draft.
Right. You could say it right now.
Right.
You could say it right now. That's really the key. Yeah. Scott, let's on the flip side of things, I wanted to get your take on who did the best selling yesterday. Like we always talk about adding. Who do you think did the best job? And we said it was the seller's market. Who did the best job of selling and getting a return yesterday?
Yeah, I know. I saw Don Sweeney in Boston, talking about, when you're selling, it's an admission of failure, right? I mean, on some levels. And, Mike Grier's got a whole, man, that's ugly in San Jose and has been for a few years. Boston got ugly real quickly. And I think a lot of us had been imagining that this day was going to come 2 or 3 years ago. And, they won a President's Trophy, then got knocked off by Florida. But listen, that team has defied expectations. Zdeno Chara goes, Patrice Bergeron, David Krejci. The team continue, it looks like it's ready to take that giant step back, and it hadn't. And then this year it did. And I think the return for Don Sweeney on, you think of Brandon Carlo, you think of Trent Frederick, and you think of course, Marchand, and you think about how different that roster is right now. Now you have to turn those assets into that next generation. And, like part of this is, I feel so bad for Charlie McAvoy, and having chatted with him before the Four Nations, and you just know how important he is to the Bruins and what he was so important to Team USA, and really unfortunate for him with the injury. But I think that exacerbated the final decision in Boston, where like, we are going to take this giant step back. It is a seller's market. I thought they did Don Sweeney did a really nice job on bringing in assets. Now you have to retool. And how quickly can you do that for a team that still has a really, I don't know. What do you guys think? Is Brad Marchand immediate? Do you automatically assume he signs back in Boston?
No,
I would not.
I think this is a Brian Leach situation. Yeah. I was around when Brian Leach got dealt, and he was like blindsided and was upset, and I think Marchand's upset.
Scott, after I heard what Elliot Friedman reported last night, which is Marchand went to, I assume, Sweeney and Cam Neely, and said they were about $1 million apart, and he says, I'll go halfway if you go halfway. And they said, basically, they said no. And all I can say is, and I've been railing about this for years. The reason the Bruins were successful over that stretch is they had Bergeron, Krejci, Rask, Marchand. They all took less to stay in Boston, and that led to that era of success. It changed with McAvoy and Swayman and Pasternak, and Marchand wanted to get paid for his loyalty, and they told him stick it. And you know what? They're going to pay for that, because players are not going to take discounts to go to Boston anymore. Not a chance.
Yeah. And I would add to that, Mike, and I would add one more thing to that is, what was the line of communication? I mean, if you had the idea that you potentially could be I mean, it sounds to me like, Scott, and you can take this as that, it sounds like it was deal, and then things changed at like the 11th hour. Whereas I feel like, had there been a conversation here a little bit to say, hey, if we can't get to this gap here, we may need to move you and say it sooner, so there's not this potential level of animosity here. It feels like this is where Boston management failed in that regard.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I think you have to ask yourself is, if you're Boston, is the way forward with Brad Marchand? And, listen, he is who he is. He's, for me, he's a borderline Hall of Famer. I don't think he's a lock to make it. Great player, and really important, obviously, to the history of that Bruins team and the successes that they've had there. And you go back to winning the Cup in 11, all that kind of stuff. But maybe it is time to move on. And maybe at the end of the day, and maybe you could have communicated it better. All these things, at some point, I think of Chris Drury and the stuff that goes on in New York. You really do have to detach yourself emotionally from what you're doing. Some people maybe take it to the extreme, but maybe this is just it for Boston. Like, we need to move on. And that means moving on, not just at this trade deadline, but in the offseason. We're going to use these considerable assets, and maybe they parlay them into a trade for, current NHLers or young prospects that are NHL ready. Maybe it's, Bruins' record of drafting and developing isn't great. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with these assets now. But I thought Don Sweeney, to go back to your question, I thought they did a nice job when they made that hard decision. And, Charlie Coyle is in that group as well. I thought they did a pretty good job of returning assets for really good core players, but players that maybe not factor into the Bruins' future.
So, Scott, you brought up Chris Drury, so I figured I'd ask you. He kind of created his own mess the way he handled the Jacob Trouba situation. It definitely hurt the locker room. Then he started turning over the team, and I feel like, yes, they're getting more bellwether, mediocre, safe defensemen, but they've lost talent, and they're still going to probably lose maybe even Chris Kreider over the summer. So I don't think they're making the playoffs, but they're close. So I get why, people would say maybe they will. But this turnover of the team is partially because of him. And it's like, yes, you're filling roles, but I think they're going to look at their defense at the end of the season and say, we've got like 3 really good defensemen, and the rest are kind of like, okay, they're decent, but they're a different team now. They really are.
Yeah, well, it is kind of amazing when you think, a year ago they're in an Eastern Conference final, and Florida was a better team in that series. There's no doubt about that. But that's how close the Rangers are. Right. And you're right, it has changed. The Barclay Goodrow thing in the offseason was also, and again, I waffle a bit on stuff like this, because listen, Chris Drury's job is not to be friends with Barclay Goodrow and Jacob Trouba, but I also think there is something to be said for how do you treat people and how does that reflect on you in the greater NHL community? Because players players talk all the time about the things, it's the size and cushiness of the towels in the practice facility and the travel and the food and all those things. There are no secrets. And so if players feel that they are mistreated or not treated with a due amount of respect, then people share that information. At the end of the day, it's a business on both sides of it. I'm not suggesting players aren't coming to play in New York with the Rangers because Chris Drury is mean. The money will always talk.
Right.
But it is an interesting thing that the identity of this Ranger team is very different under Chris Drury. Yeah. And it's not just the players. You look at some of the personnel issues that have gone on there within their staff, and it doesn't look like a particularly happy place.
Right.
And now here's the thing. Will it matter if that team sneaks into the playoffs? And listen, I said this yesterday on the show, but the rules say you got to have 8 teams in the playoffs in the Eastern Conference. A couple of teams that may not deserve to be in are going to get in because you got to have 8. Rangers may be one of them. And would it be a surprise if, assuming relative health, would they give Washington all they could handle? Would they give, let's say it's Florida or Tampa that finishes on top in the Atlantic, would they give either of those teams all they could handle in the first round? Absolutely. So maybe it doesn't matter, but it is interesting that their culture seems to have changed. The identity seems to have changed. So what happens in the offseason? You mentioned Chris Kreider, and what happens now? I'm fascinated to see it.
Yeah.
Scott, last thing, the Rantanen thing. I mean, the way it played out with Colorado and then going to Carolina, and it didn't work in Carolina. I mean, it's a fascinating story, but even more fascinating has been what's been revealed after the trade. Specifically with the Maple Leafs, where apparently they contacted the Leafs about the availability of Mitch Marner in a 1-for-1 deal. And of course, Brad Treliving went to Marner, and Marner used the no move clause, which is in his contract. I mean, I'm not going out on a limb to say if he didn't have the no move clause, Mitch Marner would not be a Maple Leaf right now. They were trying to trade him last summer. They couldn't trade him. But it does show to me that Mitch Marner is not long for Toronto, because he would not agree. He would not agree to a trade. He keeps saying, I'm going to go to the end of the year. The Leafs are signaling to him, we would rather have a guy that we don't even know in Mikko Rantanen and get him locked up in a contract, because that would be certainty. And we don't know what's going on with you, and we're not going to pay you as much as Austin Matthews, but you may want that, but you're not going to get that. I'm telling you right now, July 1st, he is gone.
Yeah, well, and you may be right, but it is sort of interesting to me. It's kind of parallels what happened with Mikko Rantanen in Colorado, correct? I mean, you sort of, it's not like Colorado said we're tired of Mikko Rantanen, Stanley Cup champion, but it was clear they could not see a path to an extension with him, and whatever the backstory is, that it was never going to happen in Colorado. And I give Chris McFarland all kinds of credit, who said, okay, this is our reality. He's not going to be with us after July 1st, and we're going to make a move. And right now he looks like a genius, although, they're likely going to play Rantanen in the first round, and how great is that going to be? But I understood that kind of move. And I understand Brad Treliving going to Mitch Marner and saying, we have a chance. And, I assume this deal, just like the Dallas deal to acquire Rantanen, was based on securing an extension with Rantanen. That kind of certainty, I totally understand. And I'm with you on this. Maybe the writing is on the wall for Mitch Marner and he goes somewhere else. And what a great story that'll be in the offseason. But listen, this is a Leaf team that has won one playoff round since 2004. What if they go on this magical run this spring? What if they go to, and what does it take? A conference final for sure, maybe a Stanley Cup final. At the end of the day, the cap is going to go up exponentially over the next 3 years. You're going to have money. You can pay players like Mitch Marner, and if it's not Mitch Marner, somebody else is going to get some of that money. I don't know. To me, there's so much for that Leaf core to prove yet. And Austin Matthews has to prove it. William Nylander, both those guys are getting paid. You better start proving it in the playoffs. It hasn't happened. Mitch Marner is the ultimate wild card in that. If this team, if they go on this rainbow run in the spring, are we having the same conversation in June? Maybe we're not, because you have a short memory, and you have to have a short memory. So I don't know.
I think if they make a run, I think they pay him. I think they bite the bullet and they pay him. And if they lose in the first round, he will be the one that takes the blame and he will be gone.
What about in between, Michael? You're giving either or, like they're out first round. They get to the conference. Let's say they get to the conference final.
And if they make it to the conference final and he is a ghost like he was last year, then he'll be gone, because it's all about showing what you can do at the right time. Nylander, when he has played in the playoffs the last few years, has been a performer. Matthews has struggled with injury. Hasn't been the Matthews of the regular season. Marner, for years, has been a ghost in the playoffs. One round when he scored was against Tampa, and they won the series. That put 2 and 2 together. There you go.
All right. Listen, Scott, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it, and we will definitely catch you down the road.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime, guys. It's always fun to catch up.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
All right. It's always fun to talk about the Leafs on a Sunday morning with
yes, you just love it, Russ.
With no hope of winning a Stanley Cup.
No team with more. I don't think there's any team, as always, as much as people complain about, it's always the Leafs. I don't think again, no team is entering the playoffs with more pressure than the Toronto Maple Leafs are.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
That's just a fact at the end of the day.
Yeah, and Russ, I don't know, if you got a chance to look at the video of the Colorado-Toronto game last night. Again,
I saw the score. I mean, I saw four third period goals. I saw
two of them were
empty netters, sure, but that's a choice.
But my narrative here, and again, the new players, it's gonna take a few weeks for them to adjust to their new teammates. I didn't think that. I mean, Carlo was on for the first 2 goals, but then I think he played really well with Riley, and I think he may have led them in ice time. And Lawton, Lawton's going to fit in. He took responsibility for the loss when I don't think he was responsible. But no, my problem was they got outplayed by a better, a team that is better. I mean, Colorado was one of the best teams in the league in the final 2 periods. But 4 of the 5 goals that were, during without the empty net were Anthony Stolarz was primarily responsible for. And that's, again, I go back to this, he's got great stats. He's played really well this year, but I've seen some slippage in his game since he came back from the knee injury. And he was reacting like throwing his head back, and which you don't want to see from a goaltender. Yes.
No, but if you're at fault for several of those goals, it's like I look at that as just like that's an understandable thing. Like I should have stopped that.
Right. Yes. So he was responsible for 4 of the 5 goals, and like if he's a guy who's like a number 1 who's going to you're going to stick with in the playoffs, he can't let goals like that.
I was asked this question by Mick Kern, and I think they're going with Woll, and I think it's Woll or bust.
They should. I don't think there's any question. I like Anthony Stolarz. We've had this conversation enough times. He's not he's not a bellwether starter. We can talk about an Aiden Hill type run. I look at Joseph Woll more in that respect than I do. But again, Wall's a younger prospect versus Hill is a journeyman. But
right now, it really is.
Yeah. So I mean, personally, I would like to see them go with Woll and give him the net and let him go. But they're going to continue, I think, to do this goalie rotation. And now with that loss, they're 4 points behind Florida. They have games in hand. They absolutely have to win the Atlantic Division, and if they don't, I think they're in real trouble. They're good against Tampa, but Tampa is now, with Gordon Bjorkstrand added, they're a better team, and Florida is going to get Tkachuk and Marchand back for the playoffs. So, I mean, I think they have to finish in first, and they have to watch Florida and Tampa kill each other, and then they play, Columbus or Detroit or whoever. And, that's going to be the challenge there, Anthony, because, they don't do well against Columbus normally. They don't do well against Detroit normally. They don't do well against Ottawa normally. So you could see a Toronto-Montreal scenario play out. Even
anyway, you look at it, Toronto. I mean, listen, you're going to have to play the one who's in front of you, and that's that's the nature of it. And then you have to bring it. You got to deliver. So the hope, when I look at the Leafs, my kind of hope with them is that as this season has gone on, that the behind the scenes stuff that Craig Berube and his staff, that they're instilling these guys with some resilience and preparing them for a play. I mean, these guys mental, because I think for the Leafs, the talent we all know is there.
Yes.
I think that structure of the team to me, the only real question mark on the Leafs from a talent standpoint potentially is in net. The rest of the roster, I think, is very formidable and deep, especially after the last two deals, the deals that they made at the deadline. So I don't see any reason why the Leafs can't make a run. I think management has made the moves that were necessary that they could make at the time. And it's up to the players now. They have to say, what lessons have we learned this season? And from the past, where we actually don't look at these past moments as crutches, but use them as experience to build ourselves for this run that everybody wants to see.
And I just think, like any other movie with twists and turns, we're going to see Matt Murray at some point. I just think
you just want you want the chaos.
I think it's possible. I think if Stolarz keeps playing bad, that they could break the glass on Matt Murray. He's playing a little bit
like Stone Cold break the glass kind of thing.
But Bruce, I want to ask you this question before we end. Well, I've talked a little bit.
We got a couple minutes.
I mean, really, the question that I asked Scott, I think is I mean, Dallas is a successful organization, has been a very good drafting team over the years, but now they've traded, multiple first-round picks. Florida doesn't have a first-round pick to 2028. Same with Tampa. Same with Toronto. I mean, some of these teams can fill the holes with college free agents. I mean, for Toronto, Jacob Quillen is playing very well with the Marlies now. I think he could be an NHL player in a year or two. But the whole point here is, most of the time that's a roll of the dice. You get your talent from first round, second round picks, and now these teams are completely bereft of anything in the draft.
But what's the median age for those teams in the window that they're looking at? I think that's what general managers are looking at. And I look at the Dallas Stars, for example, and they're in prime years, so you can move off those picks for now because you know who your core is, and you're just trying to fill in. But when that core starts to age, then they have to make the harder decisions in that case if they don't win.
And they can afford to give up a Stankoven, because they're so deep.
They've also gotten players mid to late rounds better than a lot of other teams.
They're an outstanding, and that's a big thing. We talk about picks, but it's not just about picks. It's about how good is your scouting staff and how good are you at developing your talent, no matter where you get it from.
But to be honest, I don't see them being as good as Colorado. I just don't.
I need to see. Colorado, again, the reason why is because it's also shaded from the point of view of Colorado's won. They've won a cup. They've been through. This core has been through it. But I would also turn around and flip and say Dallas has got to be a team that's got to be pretty hungry at this point.
Yeah,
they've been close and they've tripped up, and that's a team that when you make, and again, I'm not a huge thing on. It's not big for me on like, huge acquisition at the deadline. I mean, you don't get bigger than Mikko Rantanen, I think, at the deadline. But that being said, it's also a move to the locker room to say, hey, we're all in here. You guys, now it's up to you guys to deliver. They got, and again, there's no, to me, there's no question. They don't have the question in net that Toronto has in Ottinger.
Well, Colorado doesn't have a question in net anymore either. That was the biggest thing for the whole season.
Getting Blackwood, he's been Blackwood's been pretty good for them, and we've always said that about Blackwood, that the talent is there. Does he have the roster around him to really help? So,
and you want to know something? And they, in a way, they snookered Carolina because they're going to be the big winners having Netchus, where, again, Carolina in the end, they didn't help themselves.
It worked. And again, you heard from Rod Brindamore, and it was an interesting. He says, I think we're kind of, and I know you're going to spin. You're going to spin this towards the team. But Rod Brindamore said, I think we're looking at this the wrong way. That the player, and whether it's something he noticed himself with the player, that Rantanen had certain fixed places that he wanted to go. He didn't have a choice in the matter of going to Carolina. And if you don't, and in that respect, if that's the insight, and this is not just papering things over because of what happened, that he did not want to be in Carolina. That does obviously speak, of course, to the situation in Carolina, that it's not a destination for players.
Right.
But if Rantanen was locked in and kind of like, yeah, guys, I'm probably not going to resign here. You can have. I like Sebastian and good guy. It's not going to be a reason why I'm going to be staying there. And in that respect, if you're, Eric Tulsky in this circumstance, again, you get the return. He took a chance, but I do wonder just how much, he may have thought that. If Rantanen was going to, potentially come here and go, wow, this is really great.
Before you get a guy, you're supposed
you got to find out exactly when you make that kind of a move. You got to figure that out.
Right.
And I try to get that information in advance.
If you eliminate the 42 days that Rantanen was in Carolina, and you just look at it, you traded Natchez and Jack Drury for Logan Stankoven and 2 first-round picks. It doesn't look bad. And in fact, I like
I love me on Stankoven,
and they have him under control for 5 years. But the problem here is the outside perspective of Carolina with the Gensel deal, and then they don't keep him, and now Rantanen, where he says, I don't want to play here. That's tough to get over. Now it's like, okay, what's wrong with Carolina that people don't want to play there? And I think that little specter is something. And I also
Carolina has to fix their own goaltending problem. They've let this linger.
I think it's Russ. It's bigger than I think the goaltending. Again, in this circumstance, it's a symptom of it's a structural flaw in their team for sure.
Yeah.
But if as a destination in this case, if players have this, they look at it and go, I want to be if Rantanen wants to be in a major market or a major city, Carolina is unfortunately, it's Raleigh, North Carolina, whether they like it or not.
Right.
And you have to honestly, for them to add, they have to win.
Yeah.
And you also have to, with contracts and everything with players, we've had this conversation before. Mike knows this many times. He's hammered his shoe on the table more than enough times about Tom Dundon. So I think there also the agents and players are also kind of like, do you want to be in Carolina? Again, talent's there, great head coaches there. They have things there that would make me think that a player would want to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other minuses here that, and every player is different. Every player has different needs or desires. But at the end of the day, Carolina's got to deal with that kind of an image that they have to kind of overcome in order to make themselves a destination.
Two things, and then we can end. One, what we've been talking about in terms of Dallas facing Colorado, Florida, Toronto, Tampa, 2 of those teams are going to meet in the first round. That's going to make for a great first round matchup. But the NHL, the teams, and more importantly, the networks are going to say, this playoff system, the way you have it set up, you're losing your big contenders after 2 weeks. And I'm sorry, I've been railing to go back to the 1-8 for a long time.
I think we all have.
And these teams are going to start saying, Gary, this is horse shit because we're going to out after the first. We just spent all these draft picks and everything, and we're out in 2 weeks because we're facing a team that we should probably face in the Western or Eastern Conference.
But at the same time, Mike, I'm not to interrupt, but the league is going to turn around and say, we want some of those matchups early because that's how we're going to pull people in. If we don't have compelling first round matchups, then teams are going and that's I think the league's logic in this case is that they want the matchups early to get people's eyeballs on it. The problem is that, and they'll turn around and say, this is what also makes why the trade deadline is going to be compelling, because these teams know they're going to play each other. So they're arming themselves for that. And we have a better trade deadline as a result. The one thing I did want to ask, I did not get a chance
I'm going to follow up with this, and then you could ask. I think ESPN wants it that way.
Yes,
TV wants it that way. The league, but also the league too, because that's what gets and ESPN to obviously re-up to know that they have.
I think ESPN wants the 1-8. I don't think they want the divisions.
I don't know. I think they want. They want to maximize eyeballs as soon as the playoffs begin.
I do.
I do. They want their because it's the same principle. Think about it with the NCAA tournament. All eyeballs are on the NCAA tournament in the first round.
Right.
You know, they mean, and again, you can say it's not the compelling thing, but that's when everybody is most engaged.
Yeah.
Well, I think the 1-8 is more fair, and you can still get these matchups in a 1-8.
Oh, I agree, Mac. We're not. This is not a case of where I'm arguing that. I prefer. I want 1-8 because I think it's a more fair and balanced situation in this circumstance, and gives you a chance for better matchups later in the playoffs.
Real quick things. And I think there'll be and they were focusing this on TV, and I think post game with the Flyers, John Tortorella now realizes he has to mold a lot of different players in this team in his image. I think he may get frustrated with that, so people are going to watch that for the rest of the year now. I think
you got a month again. We're a month and a half away from the end of the season, and in terms of, and this is the one thing I had to think about after they came back from the road trip is that I think everybody kind of knew that Scott Lawton was going to be getting traded, and we talked to the players obviously in the locker room. There's no question. We can talk about how teams are it's a business and everything else. I think everybody in that room probably knew that more likely than not that Scott Lawton was going to get traded. And as they came home into this week, I think there was almost, and this is just my own read on the situation, they played like a team that was waiting for the shoe to drop on a core player, and they played, and I really believe that they played. The problem is that if you wanted to keep a player, you needed to try to do something else. But if the writing was on the wall that Lawton was going to get traded, they basically, their performance this past week against Calgary, against Winnipeg, and obviously yesterday against Seattle was a team that basically it's going to be tough for the remainder of the season. There's just no question about it for this team. And I do wonder again what John, for Tortorella, because again, they didn't play well this week. Well, why? To me, I have to look at it as the common denominator is it was trade deadline week.
Sure.
So it's hovering over everybody's head. And for as much as we all kind of got a laugh and a chuckle about, the Last Supper picture with Scott Lawton, I also looked at it as it can also kind of, we know and it's not to go deep into this, but in the religiosity or anything like that, but we know what the symbolism of the Last Supper is. It's kind of a moment of dread. It's a moment of dread in reality. And I think there was a little bit of dread in that room about knowing that Lawton was that one of their core guys was about to get dealt. And I don't want to be over dramatic about it, but I have to think about it a little bit that way.
No, it's like the last time Mike ate at the Anchor Bar. Like, I get it. Last thing.
Never.
I got overly dramatic, everybody. I apologize. I kind of got overly. It's my Catholic upbringing that got overly dramatic.
No way.
I've never
gone once in your life. Come on.
I've been in there, but I've never eaten there.
How could you go and not eat?
I mean, cheese. I've eaten at both major cheesesteak places in Philly. There's no way your mouth has not eaten one Anchor Bar.
I was meeting friends who were coming from out of town to go to a Sabres game, and I went there, but I did not eat there. I refused to.
All right, whatever. I'm sure when you were 7 years old, you refused to eat there. Right. Anyhow, so let's talk, Mike. Last thing, the Dylan Cousins trade. Yep. I'm sure Ottawa is going to hope and pray that there's more offense in him as a center because they're going to use him as a center. They didn't see it in Buffalo. I know some people think, well, now that he's out of Buffalo, things are going to change. But I'll be honest, I have felt like he's never was going to be a full-time center in the NHL, and he's done well in half the job, but the bigger part of the job is the offense, and that didn't come through yet.
Well, he had an assist in his first game, and they made him the second star. So, of course, now everybody's like, "Oh my God!" Now he's going to score 40 goals and make the Sabres look foolish. I mean, you have to. I think that the organization, and maybe they shouldn't, but the organization is operated out of a little bit of fear because of Eichel going to Vegas and Reinhart going to Florida and O'Reilly going to St. Louis and winning cups. It's understandable. They've gotten decent returns on them. Remember, Reinhart was going to leave after a year, and they got Yuri Kulich and Devin Levi for Reinhart. Now, so they did get returns for him, but I mean, this deal doesn't make it's starting to sound like they made this deal because this was the best deal that they could make, and they wanted to throw a hand grenade into the locker room.
Right.
That's like, because you have to say, like it's almost similar to Toronto, but at least Toronto is higher functioning enough that they get to the playoffs, but then they don't show up in the playoffs. This team can't get into the playoffs, and the core group, even though they're talented, just doesn't seem to be able to put it together. Now they're very young. Norris is a little older. I think he's a more talented offensive player.
He's a lockstep center in this case. I don't think there's any question at this point as to what position he is.
Right.
6'3", again, good size. If you're again out of central, if Norris doesn't have all the injuries that he had in Ottawa, he's not available. So that's the chance that they're taking here.
If he stays healthy, the Sabres win this deal. But the problem is he's had a shoulder that's been operated on 3 times.
Right.
And these were not like minor, these were major surgeries. So, I mean, he was out for a month from February 1st to March the 1st. So, if he can avoid those injury issues, then I think they benefit because you have either Kulich or Thompson centering the first line, Norris centering the second line, him added to the power play. I think that's a good move. But I mean, the motivation here of them making the deal, and the fact that Kevin Adams was allowed to make a big deal tells me Kevin Adams might not get fired. And that's the thing. I mean, if this team finishes with in the bottom 5 of the league again, you're going to see palm trees being waved at KeyBank Center and fire Adams chants and sell the team Terry and all this bullshit. But the fans are frustrated because this is a good hockey market and they haven't made the playoffs in 14 years. They're fed up.
Yeah, it reads to me like Adams is getting the off season for one last go here. And if the team sputters out of the gate again next year, I think at that point that'll be when they dismiss him. So yeah, I agree with you. I don't think you're not given permission to make that move in most circumstances if you think you're going to be firing. Weird things have happened where it's happened, but I think in Buffalo's case, I think he probably gets the off season to me, but he's going to have a mandate to figure it out.
One last note. Just to show you how things are going to be volatile in Philly, Cam York in, Emil Andre out. He got a game.
No, but that's honestly, I expected that. There was a game. This is a perfect window. I get it, Russ, but it was a window of back-to-back games. You get Andre in, and York, listen, you know this watching. York did not have a particularly good week this week.
No,
but he's drawing out. But this is what's going to happen. And then Andre didn't have a good game yesterday.
No, but they don't have a system in Lehigh. It's not fair. Like one game's not fair, but I get it. Whatever. No,
but he's going to be regardless of the circumstance. Emil Andre is going to be up with until the Flyers season concludes. He's going to be up with the Flyers.
Right.
That was the whole purpose of this. And this is a hammer that John Tortorella is going to be using with some of the younger defensemen. If your performance lags, now it's easier for him to sit them without having the safety chair of Eric Johnson, knowing full well those guys are going to probably stay in. Now there's going to be a rotational basis. Now it's going to be, especially again, we have York, RFA, you have Zamula who's taken a step back. He's got to prove himself. So now it keeps those. I think it does keep those defensemen on their toes. It's audition time here between now and the end of the season. It is.
That's it. That's it for Off the Post. We'll catch everybody next time.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.